I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It all began with a shared longing for adventure, a desire to escape the grind of daily life and reconnect with nature in its purest form. My buddy Jake had been itching to explore this remote lake he'd heard about from an old fishing buddy, a man who claimed it was a true hidden gem, untouched and teeming with wild trout. According to his stories, the lake was nestled high in the mountains of New Mexico, sitting at about 2,200 feet above sea level, far from any roads or trails commonly traveled. The idea of such a secluded spot, where we could fish undisturbed and experience the wilderness in all its glory, was irresistible. For weeks, Jake and I planned every detail. We pored over topographic maps, studied satellite images, and read up on the area's flora and fauna. This wasn't just a casual outing, it was an expedition that required careful preparation. We packed our gear meticulously, ensuring we had everything we might need for a multi-day stay far from civilization. Rods, reels, and tackle boxes were packed alongside camping gear, food supplies, and enough layers to guard against the unpredictable mountain weather. As the day of departure approached, I found myself growing increasingly excited. The night before we set off, I could hardly sleep, my mind buzzing with anticipation. I pictured the towering peaks, the dense forests, and, of course, the pristine waters of the lake. We knew it would be a tough journey, but the potential reward, a few days of solitude and the chance to land some wild, colorful trout, was more than enough motivation. The morning of our departure dawned crisp and clear, with just a hint of the chill that would greet us at higher elevations. We hit the trail at first light, eager to make the most of the day. The trailhead was barely marked, just a small clearing off a dirt road, and as we set off, the world behind us seemed to disappear. The first part of the hike took us through dense pine forests, where the air was filled with the scent of pine needles and the ground was soft underfoot. The trail was narrow, winding its way up the mountainside, sometimes so steep that we had to scramble over rocks and roots. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. As we climbed higher, the trees began to thin, giving way to rocky outcrops and alpine meadows dotted with wildflowers. The landscape was breathtaking, with distant peaks rising like sentinels on the horizon, their snow-capped summits gleaming in the morning sun. The trail became steeper, and the air grew thinner, making each step a little more challenging. We paused frequently to catch our breath and take in the views, which grew more spectacular with every foot of elevation gained. The higher we climbed, the more we felt the remoteness of our destination. The trail was rough, with sections that had been washed out by recent storms, forcing us to navigate carefully. But the promise of the lake, and the chance to cast our lines into its crystal-clear waters, kept us going. After nearly 3 hours of steady climbing, the trail leveled out, and we could feel we were nearing our goal. The trees thinned even further, and soon we caught our first glimpse of the lake through the branches, a shimmering expanse of water, partially covered in ice, set against a backdrop of rugged mountains. We stood there for a moment, taking it all in, before pushing on to reach the shoreline. As we emerged from the thinning trees, the lake came into full view, and the sight was nothing short of awe-inspiring. It sat nestled in a natural bowl formed by the surrounding peaks, which loomed high above, their rugged faces still dusted with snow. The water was a stunning shade of blue, so clear that you could see the rocky bottom near the shore. Despite the late spring season, patches of ice still floated on the surface, remnants of the winter that had only recently loosened its grip on this high-altitude paradise. The air was crisp and cool, carrying with it the clean, fresh scent of the mountains. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time, as if we had stepped back into a world where nature ruled supreme. The lake was serene, its surface barely disturbed by a gentle breeze, and the only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the occasional creak of the ice shifting. We stood there for a few moments, letting the beauty of the place sink in. It was more than we had imagined, a true hidden gem, far from the beaten path and completely isolated. The feeling of being in such a remote location, so far from the noise and bustle of everyday life, was exhilarating. After the long hike, the sight of the lake was a reward in itself. We moved along the shoreline, looking for the perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was soft, covered in a thick layer of pine needles, and we found a flat area not too far from the water's edge. We dropped our packs with a sigh of relief, our bodies aching from the climb, but our spirits soaring. Setting up camp was our first priority. We pitched our tents with practiced ease, making sure they were secure against the possibility of strong mountain winds. Then, we gathered firewood from the surrounding forest, stacking it neatly for the evening. The sun was still high in the sky, casting long shadows across the lake, and we knew we had plenty of daylight left. As we worked, we couldn't help but steal glances at the water, eager to start fishing. But we forced ourselves to be patient, knowing that the first cast would be all the sweeter after everything was in place. Once camp was set up, we took a moment to relax and soak in our surroundings. The tents were pitched on a slight rise, giving us a panoramic view of the lake and the mountains beyond. From this vantage point, we could see the entire stretch of the lake, from the icy patches still clinging to the shadows of the northern shore to the open waters sparkling in the sun. The fire pit was ready to go, with a neat stack of firewood nearby, and our gear was laid out, waiting for the moment we would finally hit the water. The anticipation was palpable. We sat down on a couple of fallen logs near the shore, pulled out some snacks, and just took it all in. The stillness of the place was almost surreal. It was the kind of quiet that you only find in the deep wilderness, far from any human activity. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water against the shore and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. As we sat there, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. It was as if the lake had cast a spell on us, drawing us into its calm and tranquil embrace. There was something almost magical about being in such a remote and pristine place, surrounded by nothing but nature. It was hard to believe that just a few hours earlier, we had been in the midst of our hectic lives, and now we were here, completely disconnected from the outside world. After a while, Jake stood up and stretched, his eyes fixed on the water. "Ready to see what's out there?" he asked with a grin. I nodded, feeling a surge of excitement. This was the moment we had been waiting for. We grabbed our rods and tackle boxes, eager to get started. The air was cool and crisp, perfect fishing weather, and the lake was so clear that we could see fish darting beneath the surface, their movements quick and elusive. We made our way to the water's edge, careful not to disturb the quiet that hung over the lake. The time had come to see if the stories about this place were true. With our gear in hand, we approached the lake's edge, the anticipation building with each step. The water was so clear that I could see straight to the bottom, where rocks and pebbles lay undisturbed. Small chunks of ice still floated by, remnants of the winter's grip on this high-altitude oasis. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting a golden light across the landscape, making the water shimmer like liquid gold. I could feel the excitement bubbling up inside me as I rigged up my rod, choosing a lure that I hoped would catch the eye of any trout lurking in the cold depths. The first cast is always a special moment, filled with the promise of what might be. With a smooth motion, I sent the line arcing out over the water, the lure landing with a soft plop. For a moment, everything was still, the world holding its breath in anticipation. Then, I began to reel in, slowly, methodically, letting the lure dance through the water. At first, there was nothing, just the gentle tug of the current. But then, on the third cast, I felt it, a sudden, sharp tug on the line. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly set the hook, the rod bending under the weight of the fish. This was it, the moment we had been waiting for. The fight was on, and it was clear that this fish wasn't going to give up easily. It darted back and forth, testing my line, trying to shake the hook free. I could feel the power of the fish through the rod, every movement transmitted up the line. My adrenaline surged as I worked to bring it in, careful not to rush, letting the fish tire itself out. After what felt like an eternity, I finally caught a glimpse of it beneath the surface. It was a beautiful trout, its scales shimmering with hues of gold and red in the fading light. I could hardly believe my eyes, this was no ordinary fish. When I finally reeled it in and brought it to shore, I was struck by its size and vibrant colors. This was the first catch of the trip, and it was a beauty. Jake, who had been watching from a little further down the shore, let out a whoop of excitement. "That's what I'm talking about," he shouted, running over to get a closer look. The trout was a solid 2 pounds, its body sleek and muscular, a perfect specimen of its kind. We took a moment to admire it before carefully releasing it back into the water, watching as it swam away, disappearing into the depths. It was an incredible start to our adventure, and it set the tone for the rest of the trip. As the days passed, our fishing adventure only got better. Each morning, we woke up to the sight of the sun rising over the mountains, turning the lake into a mirror of the sky. The air was crisp, and the landscape was bathed in a soft, golden light that made everything look almost surreal. We would spend the early hours of the day casting our lines into the lake, the stillness of the water only broken by the occasional ripple of a fish surfacing. The trout were plentiful, and each one we caught seemed more impressive than the last. By the end of the trip, we had landed 16 trouts between the two of us, with a total haul of about 13 kilograms. It was more than we had dared to hope for, and each catch felt like a small victory, a reward for our perseverance in reaching this remote spot. What struck me most about the fish was their color. The trout in this lake were unlike any I had seen before. Their scales were vibrant, shimmering with a palette of colors that seemed almost unreal, deep golds, rich reds, and flashes of silver and green. It was as if the lake itself had imbued them with some of its magic, making them more beautiful than any fish I had ever caught. Each time we pulled one from the water, we would marvel at its colors before gently releasing it back into the lake, knowing that such beauty deserved to be preserved. The days passed in a blissful routine of fishing, eating, and simply enjoying the tranquility of the lake. We didn't see another soul during our time there, and it felt as though we had the whole world to ourselves. In the evenings, we would cook our catch over the campfire, the smell of fresh trout filling the air as we sat back and watched the stars come out. There was something incredibly satisfying about catching and cooking our own food in such a wild and remote place. It made the meal taste even better, a true feast earned through our efforts. On our last evening at the lake, Jake and I found ourselves sitting around the campfire, reflecting on the past few days. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks up into the darkening sky, and the smell of wood smoke mingled with the cool mountain air. We had a couple of camp chairs set up, and as we leaned back, sipping on some well-earned whiskey, we couldn't help but feel a deep sense of contentment. The lake had given us more than just fish. It had given us a break from the world, a chance to reconnect with nature and with ourselves. There was something special about this place, something that made the hardships of the hike and the cold nights worth it. It wasn't just the beauty of the lake or the thrill of the catch, it was the sense of peace that came from being so far away from everything, from having nothing to focus on but the simple act of fishing and living in the moment. As I stared into the flames, I thought about how rare it was to find a place like this, a place where time seemed to stand still, and the worries of the world melted away. Jake must have been thinking along the same lines because he broke the silence with a quiet remark. "You know," he said, "this is the kind of trip you remember for the rest of your life." I nodded in agreement. He was right. This was one of those experiences that would stay with us long after we had returned to our everyday lives. It wasn't just about the fish we had caught, although they had been incredible. It was about the journey, the challenge of reaching this remote spot, and the connection we had felt to the land and the water. It was about the shared experience, the camaraderie of spending days in the wild with a good friend, and the simple joy of being out in nature. We stayed by the fire long after the last embers had died down, talking quietly about everything and nothing, savoring the last few hours of our time at the lake. The final morning at the lake came too soon. We woke up to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the sight of the sun just beginning to peek over the mountains. The air was crisp, carrying a hint of the cold that still lingered in the higher elevations. As we crawled out of our tents, there was a bittersweet feeling in the air. We both knew that our time here was coming to an end, but we weren't quite ready to leave this beautiful place behind. We took our time packing up, moving slowly as if to stretch out these last moments as much as possible. The campsite, which had felt so lively just the day before, was now quiet and subdued. The tents were taken down, the gear carefully stowed away, and the fire pit cleared of any trace that we had been there. We were meticulous in leaving no mark on the land, wanting to preserve the pristine nature of the lake for whoever might come after us, even if that might be years from now. Once everything was packed, we stood for a moment at the water's edge, taking in the view one last time. The lake was calm, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the sky and the surrounding peaks in perfect clarity. The ice had almost completely melted, leaving only a few small patches clinging to the shaded areas near the shore. It was a picture of tranquility, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. "Ready?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with reluctance. I nodded, but neither of us moved right away. We both knew that once we turned our backs on the lake, we would be returning to the real world, leaving behind the simplicity and peace we had found here. Eventually, we shouldered our packs and started the hike back down the mountain. The journey back felt different, lighter somehow. Maybe it was the satisfaction of a successful trip, or maybe it was the knowledge that we had experienced something truly special. The trail that had seemed so challenging on the way up now felt more familiar, and we moved with a sense of purpose, eager to get back, but also savoring the last hours of our adventure. The forest, which had been so quiet on our ascent, now seemed alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. The sun was higher in the sky, casting dappled light through the trees and warming the air around us. We hiked in comfortable silence, each lost in our thoughts, replaying the highlights of the trip in our minds. As we reached the trailhead and the car came into view, the reality of our return began to sink in. The world we had left behind just a few days earlier was waiting for us, with all its noise and chaos. We loaded our gear into the car, pausing for a moment to take a last look at the mountains before climbing inside. The drive back down the winding mountain road was quiet, the silence between us filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that this trip had been something special. As we descended, the landscape slowly transitioned from the rugged beauty of the high mountains to the more familiar terrain of rolling hills and eventually flat plains. Civilization began to creep back in, first a few houses scattered along the roadside, then small towns, and finally, the highway that would take us home. The closer we got to the city, the more the memories of the lake seemed to fade, like a dream slipping away as you wake up. But I knew that the experience would stay with me. The peace and solitude we had found at that remote mountain lake had left a lasting impression, a reminder of the simple joys of life and the importance of reconnecting with nature. As we re-entered the hustle and bustle of the city, I couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia for the quiet moments by the lake, the thrill of the catch, and the camaraderie of sharing those experiences with a good friend. Jake must have felt the same because, as we pulled into my driveway, he turned to me with a grin. "So, when are we going back?" he asked. I laughed, knowing that the pull of that remote mountain lake would be hard to resist. We unloaded the gear, shook hands, and made plans to do it all over again someday. As I watched Jake drive away, I stood for a moment, looking up at the sky and thinking about the trip. It had been everything we had hoped for and more, a true adventure that had tested us and rewarded us in ways we hadn't expected. I knew that I would carry the memories of those 3 days with me for a long time, and that the call of the wild would eventually lead us back to that hidden lake, high in the mountains, where the trout swam in waters as clear as the sky, and time seemed to stand still. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?